The New World Order in history has always been established with wars, and borders have been determined according to the results of these wars. Now, the war between Ukraine and Russia in the Eastern European bloc is laying the foundation of the global order in the Asia-Pacific. Vladimir Putin's stance on invading Ukraine turned the global conjuncture upside down. The effects of the war have now extended beyond the territory of Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific. The reshaping of relations between international partnerships will depend on what will happen in this line of tension. China was the first to ignite the fuse in the tension line. The military exercise initiated by China after Taiwan's leader, Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the United States, made the Pacific quite active. Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported that air defense forces were on high alert after the exercise around the island. China has sent warplanes and warships around Taiwan as part of a 3-day military exercise initiated by Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen. After a meeting with the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Taiwan's Ministry of Defense reported that 58 Chinese military aircraft and 9 warships were detected around the island. According to the ministry's statement, these included Su-30 warplanes and H-6 bombers. On the first day of the exercise, it was announced that 71 aircraft and 9 ships belonging to China were detected in the Taiwan Strait. In response to this situation, the Taiwanese army announced that its missile defense systems were activated and air and sea patrols were launched to follow Chinese warplanes. The People's Liberation Army of China announced that these exercises will be held as a serious warning against Taiwan's pro-independence forces in order to protect China's territorial integrity. It was stated that the exercises will be held in the north, south, and east of Taiwan. Air defense forces were reported to be on high alert. After the striking step, the focus turned to the USA. The whole world expected a counter-move from the USA against this move of China. Accordingly, it was reported that the U.S. warship carrying guided missiles passed through the Taiwan Strait for the first time after China's military exercise around Taiwan Island last week. In the statement made by the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet in the Pacific, it was stated that the Arleigh-Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Milius passed through a corridor in the Bosphorus that is not included in the territorial waters of any coastal state. The passage of the USS Milius through the Taiwan Strait was described as a symbol of the United States' commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. This transit was the first cruise activity of the United States in the Taiwan Strait after the military exercise organized around the island. After Tsai Ing-wen, the leader of Taiwan, with which China is in a sovereignty conflict, visited the United States and met with the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy. China, on the other hand, accused the U.S. of exaggerating the passage of the ship. Senior Colonel Kai, the spokesperson of the Eastern Front Command responsible for the eastern coast regions of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, including Taiwan, confirmed that the U.S. ship had passed through the Taiwan Strait and made statements that this passage increased the tension. But the tension in the Pacific has reached its peak with the last move of the USA in the past days following the passage of the USS Milius through the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. Navy member USS Benfold conducted a triple ballistic missile defense exercise. This last military exercise of the USA fell like a bomb on the world agenda. The USA, which does not want China to pose a serious threat in Taiwan and its surroundings, has made it felt that it is the guarantor of Taiwan. With this latest exercise, Russia, one of China's supporters, was another side that took action against the US's numerous exercises in the Pacific in the last few weeks. Warships of the Russian Pacific Fleet held an anti-submarine exercise in the Sea of Japan. Warships also opened artillery fire at sea and air targets during the immediate readiness check. In the news published by the Russian state news agency TASS on the subject, Russian ships that left their permanent bases and came to the designated exercise area carried out tactical maneuvers in different formats. It was also stated that these Russian Navy members provided defense against any attack on the naval convoy. While on the move, Sergei Merkulov, the commander of the frigate Marshal Shaposhnikov, announced the completion of all missions. Merkulov also stated that his team had no difficulty in the sudden readiness inspection, as they'd been training almost every week since January at the instruction of Russian President Vladimir Putin. In addition to the Navy and Air Forces, Russian ground forces and support troops also participated in this exercise, as 400 and pantsy-rare defense systems were deployed in the region as part of the ongoing exercise of the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Army in the Kuril and Sakhalin regions where there are disagreements with Japan. In a statement made by the Russian Ministry of Defense, it was stated that the Pacific Fleet started combat duty in the newly designated areas to check the combat readiness of the air defense units. In the continuation of this exercise, the air defense units of the Russian Pacific Fleet took action against the imaginary enemy. In addition, the Russian Pacific Fleet air units carried out the tasks of repelling the attack of the enemy attack and reconnaissance groups and detecting air targets by the Pantsir crews as part of the exercise. With the involvement of Russia, the U.S. side stated that they will continue to work on minimizing this tension in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. Pacific commanders stated that they are ready for any eventuality regarding Taiwan. Commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Forces, Admiral John C. Aquilino spoke with Jedediah Royal, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indo-Pacific Region Security Affairs, and General Paul LaCamera, the U.S. commander of the Korean forces at a session of the House of Representatives Armed Forces Committee on Security Challenges in the Pacific region. Admiral John C. Aquilino stressed that China is responsible for preventing a possible attack on Taiwan. The U.S. commander stated that it's necessary to work to deter Beijing without fueling clashes with China. In addition, Aquilino added that it's necessary to act with a greater sense of urgency every day against a possible clash in the region. In short, the cool waters of the Pacific have come to a boil due to tensions between China, the USA, Taiwan, and Russia. This tension, which began with the exercises carried out by China, still continues fiercely. The Beijing administration, on the other hand, made a critical statement about why they held the exercises. The Chinese People's Liberation Army stated that these exercises will be held as a serious warning against Taiwan's pro-independence forces in order to protect China's territorial integrity. While all these statements continue to keep the tension in the world political arena constantly high, there has been a move that will add a whole new dimension to the critical relations in the Pacific. NATO announced that it's taken a striking step in response to the threat that China and Russia pose in the Indo-Pacific and Sea of Japan in cooperation. NATO will hold its annual combat exercise Defender 23, in a concept that will be considered the first in history. 9,000 U.S. soldiers and 17,000 soldiers from other NATO members are participating in the exercise. The exercise, which will last about 2 months, focuses on the strategic deployment of U.S.-based forces, the use of military preposition stockpiles, and interoperability with European allies and partners. In summary, the war in Ukraine has reached the stage that is now affecting the whole world and creating a huge political tsunami in the Pacific. It is about to share with you again what moves the parties will make in the coming days. The critical war between Ukraine and Russia almost divided Donbas into 2 fronts. The Luhansk region on the one side and the Donetsk region on the other are seen as the last exit points for Russian and Ukrainian soldiers on the front line on their way home. But for a group of Russian troops of the Second Cause of the Russian Federation in Luhansk, this door was completely closed. There is a serious panic in the city, and the Russians in the region are forcing Russia's doors on the Ukraine-Russia border. Without wasting any time, we will discover together all the details of this surprise situation. Putin's recognition of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic marked a turning point in the months-long escalation before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, this decision of Putin still determines the direction of the course of the war and clashes. In addition, the Ukrainian war continues to progress largely as a trench war. Tanks, which are indispensable in land battles, come to the fore in these regions as well. A full trench and a tank war is going on in this region. Clashes and offensive operations, on the other hand, affect the Russians in Donbas in a very negative way. The Russian troops, which have begun to feel this effect deeply in recent days, are losing heavy casualties, especially in the Luhansk region. At least four Russian infantry soldiers were eliminated last day thanks to the coordinated efforts of the aerial reconnaissance and mortar unit of the Luhansk detachment of the Ukrainian State Border Guard Service. UAV operators in the Ukrainian army, on the other hand, uncovered a Russian infantry cluster. After that, Russian troops settled in a farmhouse in the Luhansk region. The mortar team of the Ukrainian Border Guard launched a fire attack on this very area. The mortar attack carried out gave positive results. The Russian infantry group, unable to escape the artillery fire of the Ukrainian forces, was blown up and destroyed. In addition, at least one Russian truck was destroyed as a result of artillery attacks. It was learned that the soldiers, who could not escape the Ukrainian artillery fire in the Luhansk region, belonged to the Luhansk 2nd Army Cause. Another critical issue is that the losses in Luhansk reached very serious figures in Novopskov in the Luhansk region. The Russians began to build a crematorium due to the impossibility of getting their soldiers out of the clash's trenches. Luhansk Regional Governor Serhiy Haidai emphasized this in a post he shared on Telegram. On this subject, Serhiy Haidai said that information that the Russians started digging a pit near Novopskov have been discussed for a long time. Of course, this is not for the construction of a hospital, school or kindergarten. This was originally for the construction of a new crematorium because they have no place to put all these losses. According to Haidai, the Russian command has an interesting tactic. New units of newly mobilized soldiers, regular units or Kadyrovites were isolated from each other, stopping any communication between the newly arrived soldiers. In addition, Russian troops conduct reconnaissance through warfare. As a result of these constant attacks, there are many dead and wounded. Russian commanders are trying to prevent panic among the fighters by isolating the units from each other. On the other hand, while the casualties of the Russian troops in Luhansk are increasing day by day, there is an atmosphere of panic in the city. The heavy losses suffered by the 1st and 2nd Russian Army Corps deployed in the occupied region of the Ukrainian Donbas aroused complete indignation among the relatives of the soldiers in these Russian corps. The families and relatives of these soldiers in these two Russian corps continued their escape preparations by selling their immovable property and their other valuables. In addition, relatives of other Russian soldiers in Donbas were also involved in these escape plans. In Donetsk, with a population of 1 million, currently 300,000 Russians, and in Luhansk, with a population of more than 500,000, 200,000 Russian citizens are preparing to leave the Donbas region completely. So in total, 500,000 Russians took action to return to their own country. Some of the Russian citizens who wanted to escape from Donbas had been staying in this region for a long time. However, due to the situation getting out of control in the region, these Russian citizens joined the families and relatives of the Russian soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian cause to leave the place where they had lived for a long time. Currently, for about a week, all the train stations that the Russians control in Donbas are flooded with people. Russians who want to leave this region generally prefer the train route, but there are also Russian citizens trying to escape from Donbas by land. It shows that the situation on the front lines of Donbas has seriously affected the soldiers of the Russian army. The reason for this is that most of the fleeing Russian citizens are families or relatives of soldiers in the 1st and 2nd Russian army. cause we will understand that the offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian forces in the last few weeks have deeply affected the Russians in the Donbas region. So what are the features of the Luhansk second cause? Let's examine this cause together in detail. The transformation of the so-called Novorossiya militia units into a viable military force modeled after the Russian army began after the end of active hostilities in 2015. This process aimed to create a homogeneous semi-military structure. Republican factions could not unite due to internal clashes and differences in domains. Thus, the military strength of this group was divided into two corps. As a result, two different military forces emerged: the first Russian cause in the Donetsk People's Republic and the second Russian cause in the Luhansk People's Republic. The transition to trench warfare made it possible to eventually transform dozens of real and virtual battalions and groups into brigades and regiments of the first and second cause and equip them for combat. Brigades were also deployed to Russian standards with a dual command structure to ensure their subordination in the Russian army. The dual command structure is supported by Russian inspectors who replicate all command positions at the brigade and battalion levels. By design, those who formally command these brigades are actual commanders rather than locals. But while these official commanders were actively touted in separatist and Russian media to bolster narratives of the civil war and locals taking up arms to defend their lands, de facto operational control remained firmly in the hands of the Russians. Now, due to the escalation of the Ukrainian war, the LPR's Second Army Corps has become part of the Russian armed forces. Russia's TASS news agency reported that the 1st Donetsk and 2nd Guards, Luhansk Severodonetsk Corps, were included in the Russian armed forces. Referring to the Ministry of Defense, reports that Russian President Vladimir Putin presented these military formations with war colors. The ceremony took place on December 31, 2022, at the Southern Military District headquarters in Rostov-on-Don, with a successful offensive operations carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian troops also took serious blows on other Ukrainian front lines, including Luhansk. As a result of these heavy blows, the casualties exceeded thousands, and the brutal winds of the war also greatly affected the civilian citizens. Escapes in the Luhansk region are, for now, the beginning of the end. In the summer, when the mud on the front lines is completely dry, the Ukrainian armed forces will press the button to accelerate their offensive operations. As a result of these counterattacks, life will become more difficult, with the Russian troops on the front lines and the Russian civilians living there. Russian civilians who cannot stand the heat of war will find the solution by making escape plans. The Russian soldiers remaining on the front line will wait for the cold face of death to come, accompanied by an infernal landscape. The day lot of news is coming from the east here. Despite increased focus on the urban fighting, Wagner forces are not abandoning attempts to cut supplies to Ukrainian troops and encircle the whole Bakhmut garrison after losing a foothold in the Ivanovsky forest. Russians immediately tried to recapture it. However, for that, they had to pass through a bottleneck where Ukrainians had already been waiting for them. Last time I told you that after Ukrainians pushed the Russians further from the Ivanovsky highway, they switched their focus to alleviating the pressure on the home of a highway. I also told you that despite the fact that Ukrainians managed to recapture several important positions, this was just the beginning. As Russians established multiple positions in each tree line in front of the road, the freshest reports suggest that Ukrainians increased the number of assaults here even more. Recent footage reveals how Ukrainians are conducting artillery preparation of multiple Russian positions in the tree lines across the field simultaneously. Russian forces are trying to retaliate and even launch assaults on Ukrainian positions. However, when it comes to Bakhmut flanks here, Ukrainians are using fresh troops that are constantly being rotated in. Severe Ukrainian 54th Mechanized Brigade showed how they repelled one of such Russian assaults. Judging by the footage, it looks like they were spotted earlier than they expected, faced overwhelming fire and tried to hide behind a big tree. but eventually the whole squad was killed. Ukrainians have also conducted a successful counterattack on the Sloviansk highway near the Lysychansk. As you might have noticed, since Russia switched their focus to the city, the activity in this region has noticeably decreased. Ukrainians noticed that Wagner's also reduced support for this group and conducted a mechanized counterattack. Ukrainian 30th Mechanized Brigade showed how they completely annihilated the Russian strongpoint with tank fire and recaptured the section of the highway. And this is a very important development because if you look at the topographic map, we can see that this is one of the highest points in the region. While Ukrainians have been actively reducing the area under Russian control in the northern part of the region, Wagner forces tried to recapture what they lost in the south and conducted a counterattack. Geolocated footage reveals that the Wagner assault unit tried to cross this narrow section of the forest to assault Ivanovskaya, but as it turned out, such a narrow space was perfect for establishing fire control. So they stepped right in the artillery kill zone and were quickly destroyed. Russians made one more assault in the direction of Ivanovskaya Road, although this time it was on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Here, Russian forces assumed positions in one of the few high-rise buildings south of the road to provide cover and allow the assault unit to penetrate Ukrainian defenses. Geolocated video shows that Ukrainians successfully targeted this firing point and suppressed Russian fire, which resulted in rapid exposure of the assault unit. Judging by the available materials, Ukrainians killed at least 22 Wagners and the rest ran away, abandoning their armored vehicle. Despite the ongoing clashes, Ukrainians are still using the Ivanovsky highway to deliver small batches of ammunition. Although, as seen from the video, in order to drive through the region faster than Russian artillery can respond, they are driving at around 140 kilometers per hour on the road with many obstacles. In the southern part of the city, the Ukrainian 1st Border Detachment continues to hold the small salient. As mentioned previously, Wagner forces are desperately trying to encircle this group of forces and deploying disproportionately many assault units to carry out this mission. Ukrainians are using this opportunity to track and inflict losses on the second line. The footage shows how Ukrainian drone operator works in coordination with an artillery crew, and as a result, they detected and destroyed one house with at least a dozen Russians near the lake, another house with Russians near the graveyard, and one more house where they delivered ammunition. When it comes to the eastern part of the city, Russian forces managed to advance along the whole contact line. Geolocated combat footage revealed how Russians are shelling with artillery a high-rise building with the Ukrainians in the central part of the city. This suggests that the Russians fully captured the school and started moving further a bit to the north. After several weeks of very costly attempts to ford the river and gain a foothold near garages, Russian forces finally managed to do it. Geolocated footage shows heavy fights in this area, and many sources say that for now, the area remains contested. Russian forces also made advances on the territory of the ASM industrial complex. Here, Wagner forces confirmed that they established control over 2 more sections of the complex. Russian news released a report showing the factory shops and previous Ukrainian positions. Overall, Russians are gaining ground in the area of the least tactical significance. The most important sector is the highways, which is exactly where Russians tried to develop their success at first to encircle the city. But so far, Ukrainians have regained the initiative in this region and are slowly pushing Russians back. The sector of medium significance is stable and no party has gained any ground. The area of lowest significance is the only place where Russians are allowed to gain ground. The reason why this sector has the lowest significance is that here Russians have no chance of taking any group into a pocket. They are just slowly advancing at a very high cost and at the expense of their flanks, which facilitates a safer Ukrainian withdrawal.